Thank you for joining us for our final installment on how to delight in the Lord and on the Sabbath, in the Sabbath. Today we're going to talk about the serving and caring principle. And again, we're going to dive right into some verses to unpack this and then get practical. Our first verse is in Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 through 13, and we're going to read that back to back with the account in Mark 3, 1 to 5. It's the same story, but there's a little different nuance that comes out in each story, and I want to make sure we catch those. So we're going to start off in Matthew 12, 9 through 13. It says this: Now when he, that's Jesus, had departed from there, he went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him. Then he said to them, What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. The other version is in Mark 3, 1 to 5. And it says, And he entered the synagogue again, and there was a man who had a withered hand. So they watched him closely, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, Step forward. Then he said to them, Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? And they kept silent. But when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved at the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. So what light did these verses shed on what we should and shouldn't do on the Sabbath? Well, we see Jesus asking them, Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? I think it's safe to say Jesus answered that by his actions. He didn't verbally answer it, but it is right to do good, to save life. Jesus said back in the Matthew verse, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. He did verbalize that. So this is an important principle. This is what's something that's appropriate on Sabbath, to do good, to save life. Now that we could apply that to be, that's very broad advice. We could apply it to so many things in life and excuse away lots of things that we do in life and apply it to anything we want, twist it any way we want. But we want to look at these verses to see if there's any clues that help us know how to narrow that down. What is he really talking about? Well, he said, do good. And in this case, he talked about rescuing a sheep from a pit that had fallen down. This is a situation which was kind of an emergency. The sheep probably wouldn't necessarily die, but it would certainly suffer. And so one thing Jesus was concerned about was he didn't want suffering to occur. The other thing we learned about in the other verse was saving life. Jesus healed specifically and saved lives. And so we know that medical assistance, maybe somebody's had a car accident and we come across it, and saving somebody's life is very important and something appropriate we could do on the Sabbath. Maybe even if your pet gets seriously wounded, taking care of it or taking it perhaps even to the vet if it's an emergency might be appropriate on the Sabbath. So this is a beautiful quote from Ellen White, Desire of Ages, page 207. She says, God does not desire his creatures to suffer an hour's pain that may be relieved upon the Sabbath day or any other day. So, you know, ask yourself, is what I'm thinking of doing going to relieve pain and suffering? Is it really an emergency? That'll help you kind of determine, is it appropriate or not to do on the Sabbath as far as serving and caring. Ellen White also had this to say in the Third Selected Messages, page 258. She said, Every working of Christ in miracles was essential and was to reveal to the world that there was a great work to be done on the Sabbath day for the relief of suffering humanity. But the common work was not to be done. So I know there's many people who do work in the medical field and have medical type jobs, but even this council suggests that you can relieve suffering, but you needed to also try to avoid common work on the Sabbath as much as possible, even if you're in the medical field. Let's go to another verse, and this is Exodus 23:12. Exodus 23:12. We've read this verse before in a previous principle, but I want to pull out a different nuance here as we look at it with this principle. It says, 6 days you shall do your work, and the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your female servant and the stranger may be refreshed. Remember, we looked at that one before about the importance of being refreshed on the Sabbath. And this is an important principle when we think about serving and caring. We need to care about other people so much that we allow them the opportunity to rest. Even the stranger, the Sabbath commandment in Exodus 20 talks about even the stranger. We need to try to not cause work for somebody else, even a stranger, on the Sabbath. This is why many people don't eat out on the Sabbath, because it causes them to work. Even if they're not Sabbath keepers, it does cause them to work. Other reasons for that are also included with the story of the manna and God telling them to prepare your food ahead of time, and also Nehemiah's story, which specifically also alludes to not buying food even on the Sabbath. But this is one way that we can think about caring for other people, and what that might look like on the Sabbath is trying to avoid causing other people to work. Our next verse is in Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 27. Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 27. It says, "Now it happened that he, Jesus, when he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, 'Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?' But he said to them, 'Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him?' And he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath.'" So how do we see serving and caring in these verses? We see caring for basic needs. Now, the disciples aren't out there with scythes and harvesting the whole field. They're just plucking a little bit because they're on a journey from one place to another, and it happens to be the Sabbath, and they're hungry. And so they just rub some kernels between their hands, they blow away the chaff, and they just munch on the few grains. And so this is just a basic need, emergency, as they were passing from one place to another. Notice too the reference here that the Sabbath was made for man. And then I like this part where it says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And this is an important thing you could ask yourself when you're thinking about, is something appropriate to do on the Sabbath or not? Who's Lord? Who's going to be Lord if I do this? Will I be Lord? Do I get to make all the decisions? Am I going to be glorified in this? Or is God going to be Lord by me doing this or not? That's an important thing to think about too. We do need to be cautious always to not go to two extremes where we become so legalistic. The Jews were very legalistic, and they considered even rubbing those grains in the disciples' hands as harvesting, and that is breaking the Sabbath. And going to the other extreme of just throwing out all the rules and saying, I can do whatever I want. The Sabbath was made for man, right? No, there are principles that God gives us that show us how to delight in the Sabbath according to his ways. And so we need to look at those a little bit deeper. So why do we serve and care, especially on the Sabbath? I think it boils down to 3 reasons. 1, we value life and saving life. You know, when it comes to life versus keeping the Sabbath, we need to save life. For example, let's say you came across a really serious car accident and you had the tools of like jaws to life to get them out, and you had to work really hard to get them out to save their life. It's appropriate to do that, because saving their life can't wait till Monday or Sunday. It has to happen immediately if you're going to save their life. And that's really important, saving a life in an emergency situation. A second reason we serve and care, especially on Sabbath, is to relieve suffering. This was important to Jesus. This isn't suffering that could be taken care of as well on any other day of the week. This is suffering that was going on that moment, whether it was the disciples being really hungry, or that sheep that had fallen into the pit and needing rescuing. This was suffering that couldn't wait until the next day. So relieving the suffering is another reason. And lastly, letting others rest shows that we care for other people, not causing extra work and not doing regular work ourselves. And how does serving and caring help us delight ourselves in the Lord? I think when we are doing service and caring for other people, we are showing compassion and we're showing love. And we are literally becoming like Christ, behaving like Christ. And I think that helps us delight ourselves in the Lord by being like Christ. So practical tips. Maybe you want to go visit a nursing home and encourage the residents there. Maybe you want to go visit the shut-ins. We have almost every church, there's somebody who's a shut-in who can't make it to church and gets lonely. Maybe you want to write cards for those who missed at church, or call somebody to encourage them if they're getting lonely or discouraged. Assisting with emergencies, as long as it's something that seriously can't wait. It's a true emergency. And trying to plan ahead for the Sabbath, preparing for the Sabbath so that you can not cause other people extra work on Sabbath, if at all possible, to allow others to rest, are all important ways that we can serve and care and apply that practically in our lives. So we're wrapping up this series, and I want to ask some final quick questions, give you a couple illustrations, and we'll be done. So where do we go from here? I think balance is one thing, because we've talked about a lot of neat ideas of things you can do on the Sabbath. And believe me, if you look at all these 8 principles, there's no way you can really be bored on the Sabbath, because there's so much you can do on the Sabbath. So maybe you want to say once a month our family is going to do something outreach related. Or once a month we're going to invite somebody over to our house for a fellowship meal. Or once a month we're going to specifically kind of pull away and have family time, extra family time on this Sabbath. Or maybe this Sabbath, every few months, we're going to specifically spend it more in nature. And that doesn't mean skip church. That means spend a little extra time maybe after church in nature and enjoying it. So I encourage you to apply these principles, and here's how I suggest you do it. One is by continuing to study and learn more yourself. And I want to suggest 4 different resources for you to study that will help you in learning more about how to delight in the Sabbath. So the first one is from Child Guidance, chapter 79. It's the chapter called The Sabbath, the Day of Delight. So that's one great resource. Another one is Education, chapter 29, and it's called just The Sabbath. The third one is from Testimonies for the Church, volume 6, chapter 44, and it's called The Observance of the Sabbath. And then the last one is called a document called Sabbath Observance. This was published July 9, 1990 by the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, and it's a wonderful document that helps really dig into some of those principles we've been talking about and how to apply them to your life. I just tested it out. If you Google Sabbath Observance July 9, 1990, you'll find the document that way. So those are great things. Learn more, study more, of course, dig in your Bibles, review these 8 principles. We've talked about with these 8 principles how important it is to keep the Sabbath holy. Is what I want to do, will it help me keep the Sabbath holy? The importance of preparing for the Sabbath helps you delight in the Sabbath more. Resting on the Sabbath, that's part of what Sabbath is about. Celebrating the Sabbath, worshiping on the Sabbath, basking in nature, fellowshipping, and serving and caring. These are all important ways that we can delight in the Sabbath. So when you're debating about what to do, bring it before God. Think of these principles, read these other resources, and pray, and surrender your will to God and say, Lord, what do you want me to do? Don't push your own agenda. Don't push what you want to do. Ask and surrender it to God, and He will give you guidance and impress your mind to know whether that specific thing is appropriate to do on the Sabbath or not. So I want to share with you 2 beautiful little practices that the Jews do to remember the delight of the Sabbath throughout the week. And these are shared in Sundown to Sundown by May Ellen Cologne, and this is on page 150 of this book. So the first is called the Havdalah, candle. So it's a Jewish ceremony or formal prayer marking the end of the Sabbath. And so they do this when the first 3 stars appear on Saturday night to close the Sabbath. They light a candle, and that is a candle with a special wick. It has several wicks twisted together, and they light this candle, and it's to symbolize the togetherness of the family. And then next, they take a goblet and a saucer, and they put the goblet in the saucer, and then they pour into it grape juice. And they keep pouring the grape juice in until it spills over into the saucer underneath. And this is to symbolize the blessings of the Sabbath. May the blessings of the Sabbath pour over, spill into your coming week. And then they take the candle and they put it out in the grape juice in the saucer. So that's one practice that they do. Another one that I like is called the Basamin box. This is not a Basamin box. It's something my niece gave me from Cambodia, but it's the best I have to illustrate it here. And this is just a little box that they have with spices, something that smells really good, and they pass this around, and each family smells from it, and they say something like, "May the fragrance of the Sabbath remain with you throughout the coming week." Isn't that a beautiful practice to remind us of how the Sabbath is to be a delight to us and to extend throughout the week? My prayer is that you will not only remember the Sabbath day like it's the 7th day, but also remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and to remember the Sabbath day that it's to be a day of delighting, not just delighting, period, but delighting in the Lord. Remember, if we could boil all of these principles down, it would be to that. Does it help me delight myself in the Lord? I pray, I hope that this will help you to find greater joy and meaning and blessing in the Sabbath.